Channeled message.
Stay away from people who hate you for realizing your worth. That reaction is not always going to be obvious. It does not always arrive or appear as open jealousy or a direct insult. Sometimes it comes disguised as concern. Suddenly, someone is worried that you have changed. Someone misses the old you. Someone wants to know why you are distant, guarded, less available, harder to reach, less willing to explain, or no longer interested in keeping the peace at your own expense. Pay attention to what changed before you accept their interpretation of it. When a relationship has been built around you absorbing the emotional weight, excusing the behavior, keeping the connection alive, calming the conflict, or being the first person to repair the damage, your healing changes the structure of that relationship. The person who once had easy access to your empathy now has to face your standards. The person who once relied on guilt now has to deal with your boundaries. The person who could disappear, disrespect you, create confusion, or bring chaos into your life and still expect you to be there afterward is now meeting a version of you who asks a different question. What does it cost me to stay connected to this? That question changes everything, right? A lot of people think someone hates their growth simply because they are jealous or bitter. Sometimes that is true. Other times, the issue is more specific. Your healing has interrupted a system that benefited them. You may have been the person who made their behavior easier to get away with. You may have been the person who kept forgiving before anything was repaired. You may have been the person who translated disrespect into stress, avoidance into fear, dishonesty into confusion, or cruelty into pain, right? Your compassion may have kept you connected long after the evidence said the relationship is unsafe. Once you begin healing, you stop translating everything into a version that allows the other person to remain comfortable. You begin calling things what they are. You notice when an apology is only being used to reopen access. You notice when someone is asking to be understood while refusing to understand the harm they caused. You notice when a person is more upset about losing control of the relationship than they are about losing you. That awareness can create conflict, especially with people who are invested in the older version of you. The old version of you may have been easier to manage, easier to guilt, easier to confuse, easier to pull back into the same damn cycle. The new version of you has a pause between the trigger and the response. The pause is dangerous to anyone who depended on your immediate emotional reaction. Before healing, a hurtful message may have sent you into a panic. You may have called, explained, pleaded, defended yourself, over-apologized, or tried to fix the tension before you even had time to understand what happened. After healing, you pause. You read the message again. You ask yourself whether the conversation is actually productive or whether someone is trying to pull you back into emotional chaos. You ask what the pattern has been, not what their latest excuse is. You ask whether their behavior has changed or whether their wording has simply become more convincing. That's not cold. That's being regulated, right? That is what growth looks like when you stop letting urgency make decisions for you. That part that makes this difficult is not always the other person. Sometimes the hardest part is a version of you that still wants to be seen as good by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. That is where shadow integration becomes necessary, right? Shadow work is not only about rage and jealousy, revenge, or the darker emotions people are afraid to admit they have. Sometimes the shadow is a part of you that still believes love has to be earned through sacrifice. The part that feels guilty for disappointing someone who repeatedly disappointed you. The part that thinks walking away makes you cruel or cold, heartless, right? The part that still wants one final conversation to make the other person finally understand. The part that wants to prove that you are not selfish, difficult, you're not heartless, you're not arrogant, or not even wrong for protecting yourself. That part needs honesty, right? It needs you to sit with long enough to understand what it is afraid of. Maybe it was afraid of being abandoned. Maybe it was afraid of being judged. Maybe it still believes that being chosen by someone unsafe would somehow prove your worth. Maybe it learned early in life that peace only came when you made yourself smaller. You do not heal that part by obeying it. You understand? You heal by listening to it without letting it drive. When guilt shows up after you set a boundary, do not automatically assume you did something wrong. Guilt is often just emotional residue of old conditioning. It can mean you are doing something unfamiliar. It can mean you are no longer playing the role people expected from you. Pause before responding. Write down what happened without minimizing it. Read your own words as if they belong to someone you love. Ask yourself whether you would advise another person to keep accepting the same treatment. Look at the patterns over promises. Look at consistency over intensity. Look at what happens after you say no. A person who cares about you may not enjoy your boundary, but they will eventually respect it. A person who needs control will keep trying to negotiate your reality until the boundary becomes inconvenient enough that you abandon it. That is the difference. You do not need to hate someone in order to create distance. You do not need to prove they are evil before deciding they are unsafe for your life. You do not need permission to outgrow a dynamic that keeps requiring you to betray yourself. Some relationships were only stable when you were under-functioning for yourself and over-functioning for everyone else. Let those relationships become unstable. Let the discomfort reveal what the connection was actually built on. Let people be disappointed when they lose access to a version of you that no longer exists. Your responsibility is not to make your healing easy for people who are comfortable with your pain. Your responsibility is to keep becoming the person who can recognize manipulation without romanticizing it, recognize guilt without obeying it, and recognize love without confusing it for access. Stay away from anyone who needs you confused in order to feel close to you. Stay away from anyone who needs you insecure in order to feel powerful. Stay away from anyone and everyone who treats your boundaries like betrayal and your growth like a personal attack. A relationship that only works when you abandon your evolution is not asking for repair. It is asking for your regression.
End of message.